I was 18 at the time. I'd just graduated high school, and what was probably a really exciting and memorable time for most people was a stressful race against time for me. You see, my dad was very traditional. If I were going to be living in his house after high school, even just over the summer between graduation and college, I needed a job. If not, I was freeloading. And he swore with an adamance I certainly didn't care to test that I'd be out on the street if I was unemployed for long. I'd had months of preparation, hell, years really. This entire time I could have been looking. He certainly hadn't waited until now to clue me in on the terms of living with him after high school. But I just wasn't the type to care that much about anything until I was days from a deadline. Finding a job back then wasn't easy. I'd dyed my hair green, and my nose and lips were pierced, not to mention the gauges and the shitty stick and poke snake on my forearm that my 16-year-old self had afflicted upon me. Case in point, I wasn't getting hired most places, and being that I had about a week at the time left to figure it all out, like usual, I was in a mad scramble to line something up before facing the consequences. But then, as if some morbid miracle, a cop got shot and killed on 84th Avenue, pretty close to the pass and go out there, and an opening for the night shift position appeared not long after. The pass and go and 84th Avenue as a whole had a pretty bad reputation. See, 84th was one of the only roads in town still unpaved at parts, namely the north end, shortly after the pass and go, and it wound along a pretty deep drainage ditch where no guardrails had ever been built, even after decades of complaints. There was a particularly tight bend up the road where a lot of drunk drivers and speeding teens learned that they were not, in fact, invincible, some of them even taking that lesson to the grave with them, and the lack of streetlights just made it all the more dangerous. But those were just the logical concerns. In a tiny town like mine, people are bored enough to run with sensational bullshit, and so 84th could never just be a dangerous road with poor construction and lack of safety measures to blame, but was instead cursed and haunted. People died there so often not because it was just a hazardous roadway, but because it was bloodthirsty, evil. People's reception went out on the road, not because it was essentially the furthest you could be from town, but because some malicious entity wanted you isolated. You get it. The woods beyond the ditch were even worse. On 3 occasions since the turn of the century, bodies were found out there, 1 a suicide and 2 in shallow graves. And in a town as small as mine had been, that's a pretty sizable number. For a criminal, though, it only made sense to bury them there. Again, this place was basically abandoned and totally secluded. Really, the only other people that far northwest of town were the Waggies at the pass and go, and they weren't getting paid enough to be on the lookout for anything. Not to mention, they had their own weirdness to deal with. All sorts of strange and illegal activities happened in that pothole-ridden parking lot, and why wouldn't it? That place was the last beacon of humanity's presence in the town for miles, until you got to 90th Street, the main road shooting off from the highway. So anybody working there had enough going on at their own doorstep, and wouldn't be paying any attention to cars pulled off on the side of the road with mysteriously heavy duffel bags in the trunk. Suffice it to say, once the position opened, I was the only person in town out of options enough to drop off an application. And wouldn't you know it, I was scheduled to start 2 days later. I picked it up quick. The job was easy, and though at first I was shadowing a guy that by all accounts could have been undead, I was left to my own devices a week later. To be honest, I actually kinda liked the job at first. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. were pretty standard hours of consciousness for me anyway, and working the graveyard shift finally gave me an excuse to sleep in until 3. It was dead most nights. Sometimes, and I'm not exaggerating, I literally didn't see a single customer. And other nights, the goofiness of my interactions with various druggies kept things interesting. But those kinds of nights aren't what this story is about. The first time I remember being pretty confused was only 2 weeks after I'd started the job. I was pretty stoned at the time, so I tensed up when I saw a cop walking toward the door. But I wasn't complacent enough to blaze it before work without eye drops for fear of these exact situations. Not so much worried about getting arrested, but about what my dad would do to me. I also had a little bit of a heads up in the form of a faulty open sign in the window. The neon would pretty often flicker or dim for some reason when people were coming up to the door. Really couldn't tell you why it happened, but when I was totally fucking off behind the counter, it was my cue to act natural for a minute. And since a bunch of random bullshit was stacked up on the side of the counter to my left, facing the parking lot and the pumps, I couldn't ever see out the windows unless I was actively looking over it. So needless to say, whatever was wrong with that sign certainly wasn't something I was going to try and get fixed. When the cop walked in, I sort of leaned back as casually as possible and tried to make small talk with him so his mind wouldn't wander anywhere else. "See any crazies?" I inquired. "Not yet," he answered, perusing the energy drinks like a selection of fine wines. He sounded pretty bored, and I hoped that that wasn't an indication that he was looking for something to do. "Well, lucky you," I chuckled. "Can't say the same myself." "Yeah?" He settled on a sugar-free monster. He walked over to the counter, and I remember thinking he was either a new guy or one of those officers that just never stopped being motivated, going off his short hair and fresh fade. Though judging off how young he looked, definitely early 20s, I was going with the former. These were the worst types of cops from my experience. They're always looking for a way to stand out to their higher-ups. "Yeah," I continued. "Saw a lady sleeping in a shopping cart out back. Asked her why the shopping cart, and she said she learned from a TV show that you should never sleep on the bare ground. You learn something new every day," I smirked. "That actually happened last week, but who's counting?" "Pfft," he actually smiled slightly. "Weirdos, man." "Yeah. Will that be all?" "Yeah. $3.29. He tapped his card on the reader, and while the sale processed, I remember actually feeling slightly concerned for the guy. I wasn't a big fan of cops, but one of them had died around here recently after all, and just talking with this guy face to face sort of humanized him to me. As he cupped the top of the drink and slid it off the counter, I said, "Stay safe out there." He glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. "You know something I don't?" "Nah, just, that cop that got shot out here a couple weeks ago." "Huh?" I just stared at him. "Listen," he peered at my name tag for a second. "Carter, you can't believe everything you hear about this place. 84th Avenue. It's just a street, man. Most of what you hear about this place is embellished or even totally made up." Yeah, all right. Well, have a good night, officer," I paused, squinting at his name tag back. "Brady." He walked off into the night, his energy drink in his hand. At the time, I didn't give that interaction a whole lot of thought. I learned most of my news from memes, and it was definitely possible I'd been wrong. Unlikely, but possible. But over time, stranger things began to occur. And I'm not talking about druggies sleeping in shopping carts. I began to pick up on an anomaly with the neon sign. See, it actually didn't flicker very often. It seemed to at first, but after getting caught off guard multiple times by random people coming in, I realized I couldn't trust it as much as I thought I could. Yet strangely, though it seemed inconsistent, I realized it always blinked and dimmed for certain people. There was this lady that would come in about once a week and buy a scratch-off ticket. I figured she had to be pretty depressed, 'cause she was always wearing the same clothes and was coming to this dingy-ass place with relative frequency. Every time she'd ask for the same ticket, Cash Kaiser, and every time I'd slide it to her, she'd smile at me and say, "Maybe tonight's the night." Even in her voice, I could hear how much she needed a break. But I guess tonight was never the night, 'cause a week or two later, she'd always be back, always dressed the same, always buying a colorful strip of false hope that things would suddenly change for her. I tried to chat with her the more she came in, but she wasn't keen on giving away details about her life. She was mostly unresponsive, just nodding or giving me one-word answers, and then she'd head out in kind of a hurry. But her clothes weren't the only thing that stayed the same every time. Every single time she came into the pass and go, that sign would flicker. Now, I could have just been reading into things too much. I wondered if the sign was ultimately connected to a wire through the ground maybe, and maybe certain people were stepping over it, and those people just kind of came in the same way every time. I didn't really know, I'm not an electrician, but the sort of Groundhog Day that transpired every time she stopped by really did intrigue me. Then, one night in early July, I had another curious experience. I was listening to some podcast about ayahuasca and contemplating if I'd ever take the plunge when the green flicker of my inconsistent early warning system caught my attention. And when my eyes trailed from the neon sign and over the merchandise on the counter to the pumps out in the dark beyond, I saw a guy pumping gas into his truck, probably in his mid-30s. He had this really gruff look on his face, but I wouldn't have paid it much mind, except for the fact someone was with him, a girl about my age. While he was by the pump, she was heading into the store. She had black hair down to about her shoulders, and these big brown eyes. Her skin was kind of pale, like she probably didn't get out much, and she wore skinny jeans and a gray top. As soon as I noticed her approaching, I stepped back from the window. I definitely didn't want to creep her out by being seen peeking over the counter through the glass. She came in, and as the chime above the door rang, I couldn't help but glance at her as she beelined to the snacks. She was cute, and I was considering flirting with her at first, but then I glanced over the counter again at the guy in the parking lot, presuming him to be her big brother or dad or something. I didn't want to piss him off, so I decided to keep it casual. She was over by the coolers on the back wall the next time I found her, not looking my direction while she scanned our selection of sports drinks. Then she grabbed a red Gatorade and came walking up to the front. She put the drink and a bag of classic Lay's on the counter, and when I noticed it was almost 4 a.m, I couldn't help but inquire, "What's got you out so late?" I was scanning the items with muscle memory, my eyes meeting hers, after she glanced at the counter for a second as if considering a response. "Nothing really." "Big bro?" I flicked my eyes to the guy in the parking lot, and at this, her nose wrinkled. "EU number?" I thought that was a strange response. "EU?" I asked as the total popped up on the screen. "It's gross to have a brother?" "It's gross to kiss your brother." She smiled flatly, and I didn't want to seem creepy, but I couldn't help but get on the tip of my toes for a second and peek at him again. No doubt the guy was in his 30s, and if I had to be more specific, I'd be leaning more toward late 30s than early. He was wearing boots, jeans, and a blue and brown flannel, and had a 5 o'clock shadow I could see from the store. The more I looked at him, the more weirded out I felt. But then again, none of this was my business, and I didn't want to pry. She definitely didn't seem to be with him against her will. "Ah, gotcha," I smiled, but the whole thing felt unignorably off to me as she handed me a 10. "You guys going on a road trip or something?" Something like that. There was this turbulent mix of emotions in her eyes, and while she looked excited, definitely thrilled about something, she also kind of seemed to be longing too. I only got a glimpse of it though, as she unexpectedly asked, "You ever just do something totally crazy, like overnight?" "I mean, I took a heroic dose of shrooms once on a whim without a trip sitter," I smirked, and she chuckled too, but shook her head. "I didn't mean something like that," she paused. "Anyway, have a good rest of your night." "You too," I remarked, but as she turned and walked away, I felt a steadily increasing urge to say something. To ask her why she was with this guy that looked like he could be her dad. To inquire more about this crazy overnight thing she was hinting at, or this road trip-esque adventure she was on that had her at this infamous gas station at 4 a.m. But I was just too immature at the time, and selfish. Even feeling like I should probably investigate what was happening, probably pay more attention to what was going on, I also felt like I really couldn't be bothered. I told myself that it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't be nosy, but really I just didn't want to get involved. Though, a moment after she left the store, my curiosity got the better of me again, and I peered over the cigarettes at the truck in the parking lot. She was already inside, and at first it looked pretty unassuming. It was old and kind of a faded red, with 2x4s in the back under a blue tarp. All in all, nothing suspicious. But when he got to the turnoff onto 84th and he took a right, I noticed the passenger side window was broken, like it had been punched out. I couldn't see the girl well this far away, but her being in this older guy's truck with the right window shattered made me feel even stranger about the whole ordeal. Something was definitely off, but at the time, my lazy ass just didn't care enough. It was mid-July though, when the veneer of eccentric late-night patrons was shattered forever, and I was forced to see what was really going on. It began with a loud rumbling from the parking lot. I got immediately uncomfortable as some biker douche rolled up, revving his engine like if it were loud enough I'd give him a discount. Then he climbed off the bike and came stumbling toward the door, the green neon flickering onto him from the window. I could tell just from the counter that he was totally hammered. He could barely even make it inside. He came right to the counter and absolutely reeked of alcohol. "Give me a pack of menthols, Camel," he slurred, leaning onto the counter with his right hand. "You okay, man?" I grabbed it. "The fuck do you mean?" His hostility freaked me out just as much as it annoyed me. "You're obviously drunk off your ass," I replied. "You just drove here on a motorcycle. Seems like a bad idea." "Shut the fuck up and sell me the cigarettes, man." He was glaring at me like he was ready to swing. And though he was so fucked up, I don't doubt I could have taken him. He was still a big guy, and it really wasn't worth the trouble. "Your funeral," I muttered, grabbing the cigarettes and noting it was the last pack. Normally I would have made some quip about that, but with this guy, I just wanted him to leave. When I slid him the cigarettes, he flung his cash at me and almost walked away without his change. Then he stumbled off back out the door, shoving it open so hard I wondered if he broke it. And then, without any warning, as he stumbled along the window toward his bike, his entire body changed. My breathing stifled as I noticed his head was dented in. Multiple of his teeth were missing, and blood ran down his face and soaked his jacket. He was covered from head to toe in cuts and scrapes, and his right arm was broken, the bone jutting out slightly. I stumbled back and tripped, knocking over the vape pens, then almost slipped on them as I scrambled to my feet and chased him out the door, staring in horrified bewilderment as he climbed onto a waterlogged motorcycle, the front of it totally wrecked. "Hey," I screamed. "Man, are you all right?" He just looked at me, and as he stared into my eyes, his look was totally different than before. He wasn't angry or confrontational or even drunk. He just had this totally sober look of regret. He stared at me a moment longer, then he revved his engine, and somehow he and his obliterated bike sped off into the night, leaving me totally alone in the flickering neon. And then as soon as he disappeared up the road, the sign stopped blinking, steadily shining like usual. I sprinted over to the doors, yanking them open and almost collapsing, as I barreled into the back room and landed in the seat at the computer. I pulled up the security camera footage and rewound it a couple minutes, desperate to see if somehow, some inconceivable way, I'd just been seeing things. But though I was willing to believe he wasn't actually injured and it was somehow all in my head, I wasn't at all prepared for the sight of me just talking to the empty air. That's right. The guy never even came in at all. I re-watched my harsh reaction to the absent revving of his engine, my eyes following nothing walking along the window to the door that never opened. Then I realized that I'd never actually grabbed the pack of menthols. My hand stopped over it and handed nothing to no one. It was the same thing for the cash register, and then at last I watched myself stumble back and fall, flinging shit everywhere in a panic. I ran out the door, screaming into the night, but only I was there. It filled me with a terror so paralyzing I almost just left right then and there. I sat there at the desk for a moment, shaking. Was I hallucinating? I'd heard you can get permanent schizophrenia-like psychosis from psilocybin, but this was the first and only time I'd ever hallucinated when not on the shit. And as I just stared at the monitor unblinkingly, shaking in place, I really couldn't tell what was more horrific, if I hadn't really seen that, or if I had. But then, my eyes gravitated to the one part of my memory that was corroborated by the cameras, the neon. It was dim, and as I unpaused the video, I watched it continue to flicker, all the way until my eyes turned to the end of 84th that I could see. And as soon as they did, it shined like normal again. I rewound the footage again, and sure enough, as soon as I began to react to the phantom motorcycle, the sign started flickering. It flickered the whole time, throughout that whole interaction, until the biker was gone. So I wasn't crazy. Something suggested there was more going on than me just losing my shit. But then, what the hell had just happened? I didn't even go back to the front as I began racking my mind for all the other times the sign had flickered. And instantly, I recalled the scratch-off lady. I quickly Googled 84th Avenue deaths, thinking that maybe I could identify some of these people, but the first thing that came up was the police officer shooting. Then my jaw dropped as I stared into the memorialized eyes of Officer Brady. I could barely sit still as his eyes looked back at me from the computer screen, the same officer I had spoken to just a month ago who didn't know about any officer shootings in the area, because he was the officer that would be shot. I kept looking, and before long, I found the scratch-off lady. She was some lonely, divorced woman that committed suicide in the woods a couple miles north of here in 2011. And the biker had crashed into the ditch right off the bend 3 years ago, one of many drunk drivers that didn't react to the turn in time and went face first into the canal. I screamed as the chime above the door sounded, and I heard someone spin around at the front of the store, startled by my reaction. I scrambled to my feet and walked up front, freezing as my eyes met those of Officer Brady's, glinting in the flickering neon. "You good?" He seemed to be both concerned and frustrated. I just stared at him, totally unable to speak. "Yeah." "You on something?" He peered. "No." He looked at me a little longer, but then he walked his immortalized path through the gas station, his gaze drifting over the cooler of energy drinks. I couldn't help but stare right at him, utterly wordless as he moved in almost the exact same way as he had back in June, at last grabbing that same sugar-free monster. Then he walked to the counter, and my hands were shaking as I took the drink from him. "Hey," he looked at me, "you all right?" I stared into the eyes of the dead man. "Personal stuff. Is something going on?" "Looked like you were looking at the security camera footage when I came in," he noted, and I listened in silence. If someone's prowling around here, I could investigate. I wanted to address what was really happening, to pick his mind and see if he was really unaware that he was dead, or if he was just haunting this place, and all of this was an act. Then I began to wonder if maybe this was some kind of time machine, if I could warn him about what was bound to happen to him, and prevent him from dying in the first place. But as I recalled the biker's corpse mounting his waterlogged Harley, I came to the conclusion that nothing I said to this visage of the officer was going to save his life, and I further waged, as soon as he walked out that door, he'd be a corpse too. "You there?" He waved his hand in front of my face. "Talk to me, kid. You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed. "Yeah, I'm fine." I slid him his drink. "You gonna tell me the total?" "It's free tonight, on me. Have a good one, Officer Brady." He blinked. He stood there for a moment, as if considering investigating the gas station, regardless of my cooperation, trying to get to the bottom of my unusual behavior, and maybe in life he would have. But his fateful march to the street where his life would be taken from him seemed programmed to resume as he suddenly turned and walked out the door, just like he had the last time back in June, taking his energy drink with him. I followed him outside, standing beneath the fluctuating sign as my eyes fell onto the exit wounds in his back, the red streaks oozing from the holes in his uniform. I felt like I could cry at the sight of it. For a long time, it was almost a play we would enact every time someone new visited us, but only if they saw him. This time, a friend was visiting from London and seeing our apartment in New York for the first time. We were seated in the living room, and she came in, a funny smile on her face. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "I could have sworn I just saw a cat. Do you have one?" My husband laughed. "We sort of do." She raised an eyebrow. "You saw Francis." "Francis?" He looked at me. "Charlie knows this one. He saw him too. Francis was my cat." I nodded, smiling, playing my part. I told the story of the first night I spent here, back when we were new to each other. David, my husband, had lived here in the same apartment for 29 years when we met. I had been walking in from the kitchen, the same as my friend, and saw what seemed to be a gray shadow flicker across the floor by the door. I had asked almost the exact same question, and David smiled the little smile I now knew so well, and he'd said almost exactly what he said now. I called him Frankie, though. Everyone sees him but me. This was our little vaudeville act, carrying on as it always had. But this time the friend from London asked us if Frankie was a nuisance ghost, and we both sat there, a little surprised. "No," David replied. "I mean, I can't think of anything he does besides appear at the door." A nuisance ghost, if you don't know this, is considered a relatively harmless spiritual creature. The conversation on this particular day turned to the one in the Penelope Fitzgerald novel, The Bookshop, where the main character has what she calls a knocker, a ghost who just enjoys knocking on the wall. They're the most benign pranksters of the afterlife and usually just take things, eventually returning them. If you've ever put something down and then can't find it when you go back for it, pulling your house apart before finding it again, that is possibly a nuisance ghost, though it is possibly also just your forgetfulness. The friend left, but the suspicion did not. I kept thinking about the missing keys that eventually turned up, or the phone cord or wallet, more or less fine as missing things that return go, though they'd often made me late with friends, giving me a reputation for forgetfulness or lateness that I didn't like. But then, shortly after this visit, a favorite wine key went away and stayed away. One my brother had given me, made in France, an elegant tool with a perfect heft. This was the first really personal price, or so I thought. A few months after that, I noticed that some new favorite shirts were missing, as if they'd never come back from the laundry. But there was no record of them there when I checked, and as I searched for them, the familiar feeling of missing new shirts came over me, and I remembered that it happened every year. Each year, I would get a few new good shirts, and they would at some point, a month or so in, just not be in the house. I had a reputation as someone who didn't buy new clothes often, as I have some shirts that have lasted a decade, shirts that I like just fine. The new shirts were always the shirts that made me feel handsome, though, elegant, not average, like the wine key. Those old shirts, I understood then, as I puzzled over it all, predated my time in the apartment, and with David. I'd moved in with them. When I mentioned the lost shirts to my husband, he rolled his eyes. Only when I pointed out that all of the clothes that were missing were mine and not his, and then listed them off, did he really seem to take it in. Yes, how odd, he agreed, but when I blamed the laundry, he took offense and defended them. They didn't take his shirts. At which point, I observed that my missing shirts were nicer than his, which did not go over well. I apologized and we moved on. The news that my husband had never lost his shirts, however, began to eat at my previous, somehow placid acceptance of their loss. How much money had it cost me? But also the person I'd wanted to be in those clothes was gone with them. I had entered into some terrible pact with each disappearance, to accept it as a cost of my own nature, that I was to blame for being forgetful, or stressed out, or working too hard, all true. But I lived on a track, essentially, one that I stayed on most days, that led from the apartment to the office to the gym and back to the apartment. Most things I lost, I left in a car, on a train, or it fell from my hand as I walked, or it was in my apartment, waiting for me to pull everything apart and find it. This wasn't like that. A few days went by, and a few more, and then weeks. Who knows how long? Maybe a month or more. The feeling of being cheated by the nuisance ghost, or even the suspicion that we had a nuisance ghost, eventually faded again. It always did. I bought new shirts that were exact replacements, and they arrived and mocked me by not being lost. The wine key was somehow the hardest to lose. Every time I searched for the wine key and then couldn't find it, I remembered the possibility of the ghost. I was tired of losing things, so I decided to learn, just in case, how one went about getting rid of a ghost. When I looked into it, the methods for removing a ghost from a house all seemed, upon review, to involve a kind of violence that was at odds with how I thought of myself. Or the methods seemed unequal to the task, too simple, or they required you to depend on the holiness of people who, on inspection, didn't seem capable of summoning more than contempt. Would a ghost really not cross a line of kosher salt placed at every entrance? Or would a ghost really respond to Latin? Do we all learn it at death? It seemed unlikely, though the most beautiful idea of the afterlife I could think of would involve learning every language, ever, at once, as I entered. And so, when I chose my course of action, I suppose I was once again only really looking out for myself, but telling myself I also cared about the ghost. The first thing I tried was to ignore the ghost. I tried to act as if the ghost had no possible effect on me. This seemed like the easiest device. It was actually quite hard. And besides, when I thought of all the incidents I was now laying on the ghost, it was as if I'd been ignoring him for years, and it still hadn't worked. And then another friend came to visit and entered the living room from the kitchen, chuckling in that way that I now knew came from just such an appearance. He, like the others, asked if we had a cat, and we again told the story of Frankie. And all was the same as it always was, except this time I was sure as could be, that the ghostly thief was Frankie. After our friend left, the confidence I felt left also. It's not him, I tried to tell myself, but then, the next day, as I woke, not even really a whole day later, I knew it had to be. It had to be Frankie. I just needed to know why. Why me? The idea of Frankie's haunting had been, from the beginning, a little intimidating to me, in the manner of any of the friendships my husband had before meeting me. And so perhaps for that reason I had never asked after Frankie, never knew his story. I'd only seen a photo of the two cats by the entrance, of him and Oliver, the other cat. Oliver was never smart enough to be a ghost, David had said. I got a laser toy once, for example, and Frankie caught on pretty quick that he was never going to catch something made of light. Oliver was lovable, but he really spent his whole life chasing that red dot around the room. How did you get Frankie? I asked him. I decided to start at the beginning. We were in bed, side by side, playing Scrabble on our phones. He was a feral cat, he said. I used to see him at the community garden. He would lurk around the garden beds, likely eating whatever he could find. At some point, someone decided he was causing trouble, more trouble than he was worth, so I started leaving food out for him, which he ignored for a long time. And so then I just started talking to him, like, here kitty kitty, that sort of thing. Number like actually talking to him, like you talk to a cat. David would say things like this periodically, moments when I realized how specific his inner life was to his moral universe. That there was a way to talk to cats, for example, that all people should abide by. And the pleasure of learning it would sometimes make me laugh, from joy, as it was part of why I loved him. But it sometimes made him uncomfortable that I laughed, and so I had learned to suppress it. In this case, I asked instead for instructions. How did you talk to Frankie then? He looked at me over the top of his readers. "Why are you asking about this?" "I'm just curious." I talked to him like I would talk to you, I guess. I mean, I had him and Oliver while I was single. "So did you expressly invite him home?" "Sort of. I talked to him for quite a while. I would talk to him while I was gardening, and he would follow me around the garden and had decided on occasion to accept food from me. And so one day I said, 'Hey Frankie, I have someplace to show you,' and I brought him home. Do you ever talk to him now? You do know he's dead, right? Well, he's a ghost. He's our ghost." David didn't respond to that, but just returned to the Scrabble game, as if I'd said something stupid. My husband had a photo of himself and Frankie that I'd seen so often I had stopped seeing it. I kept it in my phone. The photo was a favorite of mine. In it, David is very young, with an expression on his face that I love, a confident, curious bemusement. Frankie is on his lap. David looks like a gay Bond villain's lover, as he might before he tries, and likely succeeds, to seduce Bond. The expression is the one Bond girls usually give to James Bond when they're about to try him. I've looked at it so much that I don't look at Frankie, so this time I look at Frankie. Frankie is also looking at the camera, looking like the gay Bond villain's cat. I was driving several months later through Vermont. It was nighttime, and we were there staying with friends while I gave a talk at a college. I had gone for a basic run to the liquor store and was wary of the faint odor of skunk in the air. It was just past dusk as I drove back with my purchase, and I had taken my phone out to look at the map, what seemed like an ordinary enough gesture, when I saw out of the corner of my eye a flash of dark in the high beam on the road. A cat, I thought at first, and then, with fear, a skunk or a badger. I threw down my phone and swerved the car, the bottles in the box from the liquor store clanking as I did so, and then swore as I heard the terrible thud that typically means you've hit something. I pulled over. I paused before I got out. No terrible odor. No instant cloud of protective musk. I picked up the phone again, flipping on the flashlight mode, and stepped out to take a look. The car seemed fine. The grille was smooth, and the front fender had no sign of blood. I lay on the grass and looked up at the car's clean underside and then turned the light off. I was so sure I'd heard it. I was late, of course, getting back with alcohol, and David clucked as I entered. "I can't rely on you to go to the store." I laughed along as I took off my coat, revealing the old shirt underneath, which I plucked at with something like despair. Most ghosts give off a sense of purpose, even if the purpose is hidden. They have the air of people going about their business. They may not even seem to notice you at first. But whatever this was, seemed to require that the missing items were the only visible evidence of the ghost. It was a strange thing to think of the cat's ghost, somehow spiriting my shirts away, but it was at least more consoling than losing them to the laundry, if also more uncanny and, well, differently frightening if you really thought about it. Which is what I did now. What would he take next? But then the thought that he was also the figure in the road, the one I hit, scared me right down the middle of me. It didn't make any sense that he'd be up there in the road, so far from New York. It had to have been another creature of some kind, I told myself. A cat would never travel that far, surely. Or after death. I kept talking myself out of it, all the way back to New York. "What is bothering you?" David asked. "Politics," I said, and he made a disgusted sound. He too was bothered this way, I knew. It was easier than having to explain. It was hard for me to imagine why Frankie would still be on this plane of existence. Why would he be patrolling our apartment? Or why would he be, if it was him, traveling north to where I was now to bother me? It took some time for me to remember that cats were not in the habit of being understood, much less a reasonable, sweet creature of purring comfort. One friend's cat would hide in the bathroom and viciously lash out at any guest who entered. I decided that Frankie saw himself as my husband's defender, and me, well, as a threat, or at least an invader. And so, once we were back in New York, I'd mustered at least the kosher salt exorcism materials, which basically meant buying a lot of kosher salt, and had prepared to try it out on a day when I knew David wasn't home. But the process would require leaving the salt there long enough that David would see, so I began by leaving the salt along the windows, and when David asked, I told him it was diatomaceous earth to protect us from bedbugs. I lied and said someone's apartment upstairs had been infected. After the first set of windows, something new. The coat I'd worn on our trip to Vermont went missing, and that night I woke to the smell of cigar smoke. I woke David, who couldn't smell it, and, annoyed, told me to go back to bed. The escalation continued after I did the windows in the rear. A single credit card, one I almost never used, went mysteriously missing from the back of my wallet. "What are you going to buy, Frankie?" I stared around the apartment after I said this. The only thing left to do was the door, now that I'd completed the windows. The idea was to chase the ghost out and then bar re-entry. I thought of the happy feral cat who had never asked to belong to someone, who now wouldn't leave the apartment he'd been invited to. And as I sat down on our kitchen floor, with a candle and a box of kosher salt, it occurred to me that Frankie might just be wanting someone to talk to him, the way David had so long ago, and it seemed at last I understood. I lit a candle, a little the way I imagined David would put food out for Frankie, and closed my eyes. "Frankie," I said. "Frankie, are you here?" I felt like I was trespassing and also making a fool of myself. I closed my eyes, putting the photo in my mind, until I could see the cat who had smiled here 20 years ago in my husband's lap, and opened my eyes as I felt the candle flame rise up like a long finger of fire. I carefully reined in my terror at seeing it. "Hi, Frankie," I said. The flame stayed high, then shot down, then shot up again, snapping at me, then down again. Was this Frankie or not? I experienced a moment of doubt, the first one, and so I said, a little experimentally, "Oliver?" The candle buckled and went low, and then, as if in a huff, snuffed out. Not a breeze stirring in the apartment the entire time. Oliver, then, not Frankie at all. Oliver, the one we laughed about, as the one who wasn't as smart. Always in the shadow of the clever vagrant Tabby, even after death. I stood then and laid out the salt on the floor by the door. "I'm so sorry, Oliver," I said. "So sorry. We never meant to hurt your feelings, but you must go." I relit the candle on the floor and sat there, watching as the flame sat, small and low, entirely ordinary, until David came home. There was no good way, you see, to tell David about this. Instead, I vacuumed up the salt that night after David arrived, and as he made us a drink, we complained of the neighbors getting bed bugs while I finished up. He never asked about the candle, even though I had never once bothered to light one. Ever, on my own. I wasn't that kind of person. I set the candle by the photo of the two cats as if that was where it should rest, before blowing it out later that night. And when I did, I crossed myself, despite not being Catholic. Who knows what protects us after all, or what keeps us, or what might rescue us, or who might come for us when we are lost and point us home. The credit card returned the next day, on the floor by the bed. "You have to be more careful," David scolded me as he picked it up and handed it to me. I said I would be. I was sad as I put it back in my wallet. I bought new shirts with it that day as an experiment, and I still have them. My new shirts no longer disappear a month after I buy them. I can't entirely say it has worked yet, but I can't entirely say it hasn't. We haven't had anyone new to the apartment in a few months, and I wonder what will happen. If our little play will go on or never return. Sometimes when I'm alone in the apartment now, I almost want to say his name out loud, but I never do.